Hi everyone, my name is Mark Garetz and I'm with Floriani, and I want to welcome you to this week's project of the week for Total Quilter. Now, what we're going to go over today is not really a project, just some new tips and hints on how to use the new tool that just got released last week in Total Quilter, and that is our new Seam Allowance tool. Now, just as a bit of background, we work with quilt blocks in Total Quilter, and we have two different kinds of blocks. One of them are artwork blocks, and let me bring one of those in here. So I'm going to bring in an artwork block, and I'm going to bring in basic block 31 here, and I'm going to actually ungroup it because this block is built of several different pieces. We see we have green pieces, gray pieces, blue pieces, and we have a purple piece. Now each one of these pieces is what we call artwork, and it's basically outlines that simulate the piece of fabric. So if I click off it and reselect just this green corner triangle here and pull it away, you'll see that it's a green triangle all by itself, and if I did that with the purple triangle, you'd see that it's an individual piece. This gray strip is an individual piece, etc. So I'm going to go backwards a couple of steps here to put them back together. But again, in an artwork block, each one of these pieces is defined by an outline that defines the shape of the block. Now, in Total Quilter, the way you use artwork blocks is you start filling them with various shapes or quilting stitches, or with you outline them with various stitches down here. You can turn the pieces into appliques. You can echo quilt. You can advance stippling in here. You can stipple. You can put a texture fill in to create a variety of different effects. But all of these would be done with your embroidery machine. Now, this artwork block here is a way for you to put the pieces in, and it also lets you stipple, for example, in a certain area. So if I were to stipple in this purple triangle, it would just stipple right in here, and the lines of this artwork outline would constrict where the stippling would go, or where the texture fill would go, or the contour quilting would go, etc. But what's missing from this, from a traditional quilting perspective, is seam allowances. So this is an artwork representation of what your block would look like when it's finished, not as the pieces you would need to construct it traditionally by seaming it like a normal quilt block, because this was designed to be used in your embroidery machine. Now, you could have turned this manually into a piece in the hoop design, or you can use the new functionality that we've given you in Total Quilter called the appli-quilt blocks, and you can do a whole new way of putting those blocks together as an in the hoop project using appli-quilt. And we'll come back to appli-quilt blocks in a second, but let's just stay on artwork blocks for now. Now, this again was a representation of a block that maybe you had already pieced or intended to piece, and you would have pieced it traditionally, and then you would have hooped it up and then lined it up using the alignment marks that are built into the program, or possibly a camera that's in your machine, and then you would apply the embroidery stitches over the top. But you'd be using your embroidery machine to decorate this quilt block, and potentially also assembling the quilt block, depending on whether you did it as a piece in the hoop or an appli-quilt design. But there was nothing in the program that helped you piece this together as a traditional quilt block until now. And that's what the Seam Allowance tool allows you to do, because we've gotten this request a lot. People have said, I really love this, but I've created this block in the program, but I really want it to give me the tools that I need in order to put this block together traditionally. So we've again given you this with the Seam Allowance tool, and I just want to go over with you a little bit of how it works. So let me actually show you how this works. Now I'm going to use this green triangle here, and I'm going to pull it away so that we can separate it from the main quilt block so you can see how this tool works. So I've got this piece selected, and my Seam Allowance tool is right here. When I click it, what it's going to do is give me an option to first of all set my seam allowance distance. So I can set it to 1/4 inch, which is the default, or I can change it to anything I want. I'm going to leave it at the 1/4 inch because that's typically what we do in most quilting. And I've got a choice of corner types. I can choose either a mitered corner, which will give me a straight edge corner just like the actual original piece. I can choose to bevel those corners off, which can make it a little bit easier to line the pieces up. And I can also round it, which in some instances helps you not only line it up but also cut it with a digital cutter a little bit easier since there's no sharp corners. I can also choose to remove the selection. So if I click this, it will just give me the new outline and it'll actually delete the piece that I outlined. Now if I'm going to cut this with a digital cutter, that's what I want to do, because otherwise it'll try and cut both of them and that won't work out so well. And we'll see that in the next section of this video. But for now, let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to go ahead and leave remove selection unchecked so you can see how the outline comes in here. And I'm going to click miter so you can see how the sharp one works, and I'll go ahead and click OK, and that's going to create a new outline. Now that's very, very faint, and it came in gray, unfortunately. So let me change it to a darker color. Let me change to this dark green here so you could see it a little bit better, and let me change my pen width to 1, so again it'll be a little bit fatter so you could see it. So you can see here I've got that new outline around the piece, and it's got sharp corners. If I undo that all the way back to here and I reselect it and I reselect my seam allowance tool, I'll show you what bevel looks like. So if I do that, and again this time I'll just change my pen width, hopefully you'll be able to see that. You could see the beveled corners here, and let me undo that a couple times and I'll go back, reselect it, and I'll show you what round looks like. So this is what the rounded corners look like. Again, let me change my pen width to 1 and click apply so you can see that a little bit better. So that's how the tool works. Now in the real world, if we want to use this from a practical perspective, we probably want to do a few more things. So let me undo this all the way back to where I had my pieces all put together, because let's assume that I'm going to send this to a digital cutter. So what I want to do when I do that is I want to cut all the same colors together. So I want to cut my green and my green and my green together. Now there's a really cool way to do that, and that is with this cut preview button right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all my greens. Oops, I didn't hold down control. Hold on a second. So I'm going to select all my greens, and now I could copy and paste them to a new screen, but an easier way to do that is just simply click this cut preview, and that will automatically copy them to a new screen. And now what I can do is apply my seam allowances to them. All right, so I'm going to select this piece first, and I am going to apply my seam allowance, and this time I'm actually going to remove the selection and I'm going to leave it as beveled. So if I click OK, it'll do that piece. I can do the same thing with this one. I'll remove the selection, click OK, and then I will do it one more time with this one. And now I've got my pieces all set to go. So you can see these a little bit easier. Let me fill them in for you. So those are my cut pieces, and I'm all set to cut the green. Now what I would do is I would come back here and I would repeat that for the blue pieces. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to select this blue piece, and I'll hold down Control and select that blue piece, and I will again click my cut preview screen. So it's going to open up a new window. Now one thing I need to do is, before I apply my seam allowance to this, if I do them individually like this, I am okay. I can do that piece, and then I can do this piece. Okay, so now I've got my two pieces. I need to move this one away so it will cut them, and I apologize that you can't see them so well. Let me change the pen width to 1 so you could see them. So there's my 2 pieces. So I could send this to my cutter just like this. So I've got this window with my blue and this window with my green. Now, let's go ahead and do the gray pieces. So I can do this gray piece, and I'll hold down Control and get that one, and hold down this one and get that one. And I will once again do my cut preview to get them all onto a new screen. Now you might be tempted to select all of them and create the seam allowances all at once. And in certain instances, like here, that will actually work. So if I select them all and I do my Seam Allowance tool and I remove the selection and click OK, I will have these 3 pieces. But you'll notice over here that they are one piece of artwork. Now, if I'm just going to cut them just like this, that's okay. A cutter will actually cut this as one piece. But if I want to move these around with relation to each other, like I want to get them closer together, I can't move them individually. What I need to do is come over here and right click on it and say break apart. And when I do that, now I can actually move the individual pieces. All right, so that's a way to do that. Now I'm going to go back to the original design because I want to show you a pitfall. If you select this blue piece and this blue piece, and now we once again do our cut preview. So now I've got my 2 blue pieces here. If I select them all and I come here to my Seam Allowance tool and I click it and I say remove selection and I say OK, I want you to watch what happens. Now let me change my pen width to 2 so you can see that. What's happened is because they were touching, it's actually created one big piece out of this, which is not typically what I want to happen. What I wanted was individual pieces. So let me go backwards and show you how to get rid of that problem. The reason that it did that is because these 2 pieces are too close together. They're actually touching. Now if I move them a little bit apart, like I move them just a tiny bit apart, and I select them all, and I repeat that procedure, and I remove the selection, you'll see that I still have them connected as one piece. And the reason is, if I go back, so you could see before I did that, these are so close together right here, they are less than the width of my seam allowance. So when it added that seam allowance in, it actually also tried to reconnect them. So I need to get them far enough apart so that the seam allowances don't intersect. And now if I do that, I can click here and remove the selection, and now I've got my 2 independent pieces, but once again I need to break them apart. Now let's go back to our let me just undo this for a second here to come back to here so you can see these 2 pieces. Now the question really is, did I need to actually do these 2 pieces for this quilt block? Because guess what? These 2 triangles are exactly the same. So I can just cut it twice. So to get rid of that problem, like where they're connected there, I could come back to my original. Instead of exporting both of these, I could just export one of them by doing my cut preview, and then I can apply my seam allowance to it. So let me do this. I'll remove this selection and I'll do my, let me just fill this one so you can see it rather than changing my outline, and I'll zoom out a bit so you could see. Now if I wanted to cut 2 of these, I could just simply copy and paste it, and now I have a second one. Okay, so I could do that with any of my pieces that end up being the same size. Now if I go back to my original to look at this, you could see that this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece, they're all the same size. They're all the same triangle. They're just rotated in different colors. So I really don't have to do this so many times for each color. I could do it once and then I could recolor them, or just know when I send it to the cutter to put a piece of different fabric down and just recut the same piece. Now, what you might want to do, however, is this. So let's cut our gray pieces again here. So let me select this gray piece, hold down Control and Control one more time to select my grays, and I will do a cut preview. So here are my gray pieces. Now I know these are far enough apart to where if I did them together I could, but let me just do them individually. So I'll do my cut preview, I'll remove the selection, I'll do this one, do my seam allowance rather, do my remove selection, and finally I'll do this one to do my last piece. So there are my 4 pieces. Let me select them all and fill them in so you can see them a little bit better. So these are the pieces that I would cut, say send to my digital cutter. Now, if I were to actually do just one of these blocks, I can probably leave this the way it is and put a piece of fabric down on my cutting mat and cut them. However, if I wanted to do more than one, and I had a bigger cutting mat, bigger piece of fabric, I might want to cut them all together rather than cutting each block individually. So what I could do is I could start to move these around to fit more of these on a page. Now I can do that a couple different ways. I can click this button right here to show me my cutting mat so I could see that the maximum that I could fit on a cutting mat, but maybe I want to actually just use a portion of the cutting mat. So if I want to use the full cutting mat, I would use this preview cutting mat tool here to copy and paste and position these on the cutting mat. But if I say I was using a piece of 10 by 10 fabric, so it was less than the size of my cutting mat, I'm going to show you a trick that you can do so you could see the edges of where that fabric might be. And you can use the rectangle artwork tool to create that piece. So I've clicked that piece. I'm just going to drag a rectangle. I'm not going to worry about sizing it because once I've done that, I'm going to come over here to my Transform tab, make sure that Maintain Aspect Ratio is unchecked. And like I said, if I was simulating a 10 by 10 piece of fabric, I would come here and put in 10 and 10 and click Apply. And there's my fabric outline. Again, I might come back to my Artwork tab and I might make my pen width 2 so I can see that a little better. So that represents the piece of fabric that I've cut. And now what I can do is I can select my pieces and I can move them around within that outline to cut them. And I might be able to actually select all 3. I'll just select all 3 here, my sequence view, and I'll do a copy and paste, and then I might rotate them 90 degrees or actually 180 degrees and move them up into here so I can cut them again. So now I will have cut them on my block piece of fabric. So now I've cut 2 blocks worth on this piece of fabric. Now before I send this to the cutter, you want to make sure that you delete the artwork that was your outline because you don't want to cut that. So I would select that. I'm going to press the delete key on my keyboard to delete them. Now to export these for cutting, what I would do is select them all, and I would come over here to my file menu and I would select export artwork, and it would allow me to save them either as an SVG file or a plot file, an Adobe Illustrator file, or if you have a Brother Scan and Cut, you could go straight to the Scan and Cut FCM format and then send that file to your digital cutter and cut this pattern out. So that's how you would use this with a digital cutter. Now we're going to come back to digital cutters in a second because there's one other thing you need to know about cutting these on a digital cutter. But some other strategies might be that you might print this out using your print preview right here to print them on a piece of template tearaway. Now this is too big for the page size that I have, so it's splitting them up. But that's another thing you could do. You could print this template on a piece of template tearaway, stick it down to your fabric, and then cut around the edge with a rotary cutter to cut out your blocks. You could also print this out on a piece of traditional paper like you would a regular quilt pattern, and then again use a ruler and a rotary cutter to cut out those patterns. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that, but that gives you an idea of the different ways that you could cut out this block or the pieces of this block so that you could then piece them together traditionally. Now, what I want to discuss right now is what if you want to do this, but you're making an appli-quilt block or you're using one of the built-in appli-quilt blocks. Because if you are designing a block from scratch or tracing a block, it's much easier to do it as an appli-quilt block than if you are using an artwork block. But appli-quilt blocks are not artwork. Let me get a new piece of paper, a new design window here, and let me bring in an appli-quilt block. We'll bring in that same block. We'll go to a basic block. We'll find basic block 31 here, which is the same block, but this does not have traditional artwork pieces that you could separate out and apply your seam allowances to, because this is an appli-quilt block. But we do have a really cool tool in the appli-quilt function that allows you to get the artwork pieces out of this block. And the way you do that is you right-click on the block. Actually, you select it first. You right-click on the block, and then you say Get Fills as Artwork. Okay, so now what we have is our artwork just like we did with an artwork block. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete the original block because I don't need that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And now what I've got is basically the same thing that I had before. So if I wanted to do my gray pieces, I need to actually ungroup it. So let me ungroup it. So I'd select my 3 gray pieces, and then I would do my cut preview one more time. And here I would have my gray pieces, and now I could apply my seam allowance to them. So that is how you would actually do an appli-quilt block as a traditional block using the seam allowance tool. Now one more thing I want to talk about, and that is cutting these pieces on a digital cutter, because it's not easy to cut these pieces on a digital cutter because we're not doing appliques. We're not going to put a piece of applique wonder or appli-stick behind them. So you have a couple options. Some of the cutter manufacturers make a mat that has a very high tack that will hold a piece of fabric in place while you cut it. And that works until that mat starts to lose its tack, and then you have to get a new mat. The other thing you can do is you can starch these pieces of fabric before you cut them so that they cut nice and even and don't fray, but then you have to take the starch out before you want to piece the quilt together. But I've come up with another way to do it, and that is using a Quilters Select product called Quilters Select Cutaway. And that is just like our nylon no-show mesh, but it's much lighter weight. In fact, it's so lightweight you can leave it in your quilt and not even bother to remove it. So this is a fusible cutaway. So the way this works is you would take your piece of quilt fabric, you would first iron this piece of cutaway onto the back of it, and then you would stick it down to your normal tack mat. And then, because that piece of cutaway is going to stabilize the fabric, you can actually cut it with your normal cutting blade and your normal mat, and it will cut nice and clean. Now you'll have to experiment with your cutting depth, your cutting speed, and your cutting pressure depending on the cutter that you are using, but it does cut the pieces out just fine. So again, that's Quilters Select Cutaway that you would fuse onto the back and stick it down to your mat and then cut the pieces out, and it is so lightweight that you can leave it in. So that ends this project of the week, this tips of the week for Total Quilter, and come back next week for more tips and projects with Kathy Quinn.